Client fingerprinting. So we're now going to be taking a look or building on what we explored briefly in the previous video when we were talking about active client information gathering techniques. And we're going to be focusing on client fingerprinting in this video. And more specifically, we'll be taking a look at browser fingerprinting. And I have a little bit of a demo at the end of the video that will again show you how this is done and how I typically do it, and you'll see just how useful this information can be, or rather how useful this tip that I'm going to share with you is. So before we actually get into the demo, I need to clarify or explain a couple of things about client fingerprinting. So what is client fingerprinting? And I know I explained it in the previous video, but let me re-explain it now with all the context that you've been able to gather. So client fingerprinting is an active client information gathering technique that is used to gather information about a target system's web browser and the underlying operating system in order to aid in the development of tailor-made or client-specific payloads for initial access. Now, client fingerprinting plays an important role in the success of a client-side attack, as it provides the attacker with accurate information, and that's the key word here, accurate. We want to be sure. It provides the attacker with accurate information of the client-side software that's running on the target or the employee's computer. Now, in the context of client-side information gathering, it allows us to identify key information about the client-side software running on the target or target system, for example. And this is really where we'll be narrowing down. We have browser and browser version info, the operating system, and system architecture. Expanding a little bit on client fingerprinting, information about the target employee's computer is typically not publicly accessible, which means this is not a passive client information gathering technique, as you've been able to ascertain. And as a result, we must obtain this information from the target itself, the target system itself. Now, does this mean we're connecting or we're performing a port scan on the employee's computer? No, it doesn't. It just means we're now initiating contact with the employee, and you must be aware of this because whenever you are performing a red team engagement or a pen test, you need to have this categorization. And remember that once you initiate contact, you need to again avoid being suspicious or doing anything too innocuous that again might actually trigger or make the employee a little bit suspicious of you. So as I mentioned in the previous video, this will involve utilizing social engineering techniques like phishing to coerce the target employee into clicking a link to a web page that we control. And this is the typical technique that is used to perform client fingerprinting. So we need the employee to click on a link, and that link will be running some client-side code or JavaScript code that will tell us more about the browser that they're running, as well as a little bit more info. So this web server that we'll need to configure, and again I'll be showing you how to do this, will typically be configured to run a script that obtains information like the browser version and the operating system version from the browsers or users who visit that particular site. So that brings us to browser fingerprinting. All right, so browser fingerprinting is a subset of client fingerprinting that is focused on learning more about the employee or the target's browser or the browser that they're using on their computer, right? So it's an active information gathering technique that leverages client-side scripting languages like JavaScript to extract information about the target's browser and the underlying operating system. So why are we leveraging client-side languages like JavaScript? Well, if you know anything about the web, you know that JavaScript is executed locally on the client's browser. And we can actually develop a custom JavaScript code or snippet, if you will, or script rather, that when executed, when the employee or the target accesses this website that we set up, when it's executed, it will tell us what their user agent is and a bit more regarding the browser that they're running, which can also tell us about the operating system that they're running. So in order to perform this technique, you will need to purchase a domain. Now that's not necessary for this demo, but I'm just giving you an example of what I would do in a red team engagement. But I would, purchase a domain and set up a fictitious web page that runs a specific JavaScript script or code when users visit that particular web page. The JavaScript code can be embedded into the homepage of the website and should log or send the browser fingerprint of users who visit the web page. So in the demo that I'll be giving you, I'll show you how this can be saved so you can actually access it after the fact. Remember, we need this info to be saved so we actually know it. In order for this client-side information gathering technique to work, the target's or the employee's browser must be able to run the typical client-side code used in modern web pages, for example, JavaScript. Now, it goes without saying that most, or rather all, modern web browsers support the execution of JavaScript. However, you'll find that in certain cases, some privacy-focused browsers have the ability to block the execution of JavaScript code unless specified otherwise. So an example of that are browsers like Brave, which will actually block JavaScript from being executed, and you need to be aware of this. So this is not a foolproof technique, but in most cases on employee computers, you'll typically have the standard web browser collection. You typically have Edge, which is not that common, but Firefox, Chrome, etc. And unless they have extensions like, for example, in Firefox, extensions like uBlock that block JavaScript, we should be able to identify or learn more about the browser of the target employee. So our primary objective is to identify the following info: the web browser, so the name, so is it Firefox, is it Chrome, is it Brave, is it Edge, etc. The web browser version, so and the reason for that is because some web browsers may be outdated, or some versions of web browsers may be susceptible to inherent vulnerabilities, or CVEs, if you will. We also want to know what plugins or extensions they have, because again, in certain cases, some extensions may be vulnerable, or alternatively, some extensions can actually assist us in exploitation or facilitation of the client-side attack. And the final piece of info, which again is not always, it's not always something you'll get, is the underlying OS version. So what operating system is running on that computer? Is it Windows, Linux, Mac, etc.? We can also, in certain cases, get info like the actual operating system version, which is fairly easy to identify, and the system architecture. So is it 32-bit or 64-bit? And that's really what our objective is here. Now, for the demo, I'll be utilizing the following tools or libraries. So instead of generating our own JavaScript code, we can easily generate our browser fingerprinting web page by leveraging existing JavaScript libraries like Fingerprint.js2. Okay, and Fingerprint.js2 is really, really awesome. I use it quite a bit. It's a modern and flexible browser fingerprinting library that enumerates a lot of useful information about the browser and the underlying operating system. And you can actually learn more about it by taking a look at the GitHub repo here. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in the practical demo section. So in order to show you how this works in a practical sense, I'm going to be walking you through what I typically do, not to the full extent, but in terms of the infrastructure and the setup with regards to performing browser fingerprinting, especially during red team engagements. Now, as I said, this is not a live lab on the INE platform, and it's something you can do really on any operating system. As long as you have the ability to develop a web page, you can easily do it. So whether you're on Windows, Linux, or Mac, you can pretty much follow along. As I said, the library that we'll be using is available on GitHub. So with that being said, I'm going to switch over into my Kali Linux virtual machine, and I'll see you there. Alright, so I am currently back in my Kali Linux virtual machine, and as you can see, I have the Fingerprint.js GitHub repository opened up here. And as you can see, it's a modern and flexible browser fingerprinting library. Now, you can use this library or you can include it in an existing web page or website or web application regardless, but it's essentially a JavaScript library that provides you with functionality to obtain or extract browser information or perform browser fingerprinting. right? And this is on a side note, this is one of the reasons why browsers like the Brave browser exist, to prevent fingerprinting or websites from tracking you, because remember, your browser fingerprint is sort of like your identity online. But in our case, we're really not interested in anything other than what I stated in the slides. So to use this, there's multiple ways you can go about using it. As I said, you can include it in your own web page that you're developing. So there's instructions on installing it. You can either call you can actually include it in an HTML here by including this as a script. So you have the CDN, and there's two versions. One is delivered by JS Deliver, and then of course CDN JS right over here. Or you can have the scripts locally stored on the web server. It's entirely up to you. Now, in the example that I want to give you, I'm running on Kali Linux, and we're going to need a web server. All right, so that's the first requirement. And in our case, we're going to need something like Apache. So if you are on Kali Linux or on any Linux or Mac OS system, you can easily set up Apache by saying sudo apt get install Apache 2. Right, and I'm just going to put in my password there, and in my case looks like we have a bit of an update here, so let's update it. Why not? And then we are going to wait for that to complete installing, and after which we are going to all right, looks like we're done. There we are. So I'm now going to say sudo system control start Apache 2 just to start it up, and I'm just going to check the status. So there we are. You can see it's active and loaded. So you can replicate what I'm about to show you on any web server that again resolves to a domain. In my case, I'm just going to be doing this on my local host or my Kali Linux IP, and you can see that my Kali IP is right over here. If I check to see whether we have port 80 running, you can see that it is running over here, which means if I open up my browser and say 127.0.0.1, that'll open up the Apache web server, and we don't have anything in the web root or the root of the web server. So on Linux, the default directory is var www html. So this is where you store your website files, especially with Apache. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage the Fingerprint JS to default homepage or website, if you will, which is a very simple HTML website. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm just going to clone this repository into this particular directory here. So I'm going to say sudo git clone, because we need sudo privileges to make changes to this particular directory. There we are. It's going to clone that, and now we have a folder called Fingerprint JS2. So make sure your Apache web server is running, and I'm going to reload the web server and open up that directory, and you can see it's going to bring up the simple web application here. So for demo purposes, Fingerprint JS has this demo website or rather index.html page that will display your browser information, or perform browser fingerprinting and display the information on this particular web page when you click on Get My Fingerprint. So if I click on that here, you can see that you have the fingerprint which is randomly generated, the time it took to calculate the fingerprint, and then all of this info here. So this is all the info that someone can get about you just through you visiting a particular website, if they have this script running or a similar script running. So the first piece of info is the user agent, which says we're running Mozilla Firefox, and it's running on a 64-bit Linux computer or operating system, and we have the Firefox version and the WebKit here. The language is English US. That is also very useful because, for example, if we targeted an employee that was German and had their browser locale set to German, we would then need to send them an email in German again to increase our chances of success. So you can see how useful this is. We also have a bit of other information, for example, the regular plugins here, as well as let's see right over here, there we go, whether there should be the option to, or there we are, ad block is false. So an ad blocker is not running, or at least is not configured to block ads on this particular website. And again, in real life or in the real world, this would be a domain name that you have set up, again, just for this purpose. So one example I can give you is, for example, let's say through your passive reconnaissance, you realize that a particular employee has an interest in video games, or let's say in construction. Then you can set up a website with the domain name that, for example, is like construction advice, or video game news, or something like that, and or something, a domain name that alludes to the interests of the target employee. So you just buy that domain. Again, it doesn't need to be anything crazy, and then you configure the fingerprinting site or script here. And of course, you don't want them to see this. I'm just doing this to show you how Fingerprint.js works. The bottom line is all of this info is useful. Now, I'll show you how to conclusively tell what operating system is running and what version of Mozilla is running in a few seconds. Before I do that, however, we need to modify this particular web page. And again, we're just using it as an example, but we need to modify it to obviously not show this info and make it look a bit realistic. But also, we want it to save all of this info in a text file for every user that visits this particular website or web page. And we want to save it on our web server. So how can we do this? Well, we can do this by going into, so we open up the Fingerprint.js folder that we cloned. You can see that we have the JavaScript code, which we don't need to touch, and then the index.html page, which is actually what we want to modify. So I'm going to use Vim, and again, make sure you use sudo privileges. You can use any other text editor you want, but I'm going to modify it with Vim. I'm going to say sudo vim index.html. All right, so you obviously want to change the title of the site. So we can just use that example I gave you there. We can just say, we'll just call it construction tips, right? And we can modify the site a little bit here. But we can see that it's calling for, there's obviously some jQuery being included in here, which is fine. And then we have a Google Analytics tag there, which again can be quite useful, and then some CSS in here, which is not an issue. H1 Fingerprint.js, we can just call this, what did we call the site here? I'll just call this construction tips, right? And we don't want to display this information here. So, we can just say, for example, click here to get the latest construction tips. And of course, I'm being as silly as I can, but you get the idea. So I'm going to change the button label to get construction tips. All right, very, very simple. And then we have an image here that, again, actually we don't need to include. That's that GitHub repo for the actual icon for the JScript or Fingerprint.js library. So I'm just going to comment this here. And then we have the actual Fingerprint.js 2 script. So that's included. And it's not through the CDN, it's the locally stored one, which is great. And then we can see this script right over here. So when an ID called button is clicked, this script is executed. So you can see we have a few variable declarations. So D1 is equal to new date, and FP is fingerprint is equal to new fingerprint, and then we can see fp.get function result components. Those are the return values, and then the new variables in here called D2, that's going to be equal to new date, and then we have the time string, so time took to calculate the fingerprint, and which is what we got on this page here. So that's what we don't want that to be displayed, as well as the browser fingerprint. We have the detailed info, which is what we want, but this is being parsed in HTML. So we're going to need to make a few changes here. So the time it took to calculate the fingerprint, we can leave that for now, although it's not really important. And then the details we need to change because it's parsing it in HTML. You can see we have the strong and the break the break tags here. So because we want to save this in a text file on the server, we're going to get rid of the HTML tags here, and we're going to change this so the output is a little bit clearer. We're going to specify the new line operator, so just new line here, so that all values or pieces of info are on a new line. We can see that we have if type of window.console is not undefined, then this particular JavaScript is ran, where we have the we have a for loop here, so variable index in components, so for object is equal to components and then the array index. So don't worry what all of this means, it's just the actual values or the information from the actual fingerprint process. But we can see that the variable line is equal to object key, which is equal to value.toString.substring. So what this is referring to is how each piece of info is formatted. So you can see user agent equal to, and then that's converted to a string, and then console.log line, the details plus equals line plus, and then this is where the values are stored. So what we want to do, instead of breaking here, because we don't want HTML, we are going to need to set this to a new line, so that every entry is on a new line right over here. So that's the first thing. We then have another segment here where the ID details.html, so this is the actual rendering of the results in HTML. We also have text, but you can see what's being rendered is details, result, and time string. So what we can actually do now is, under this we can actually say, and we're going to need to create a PHP script that's separate, but it'll essentially save the web browser fingerprint into a text file, but we need to call it. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to need to use something like XML HTTP. So we're going to say var XML HTTP, and we're going to say new XML HTTP request. So we're going to call that here, new that function, and we're going to say right over here XML http.open, and we're going to say post. We want to send that data. Once the button is clicked, we're going to say post, and this is going to be to a script called, we can just call it fingerprint.php, right? And the fingerprint.php is what's actually going to save the fingerprint. So I'm just going to hit enter now, and we're going to say XML http.set the request header, because that's required, request header, and we want to specify that this is coming in txt format. So we're going to say the header we want is content type, and the value for that is going to be application txt. All right, and we're going to close that there, and then we need to send it. So we need to send this, so XML http.send, or rather all that data that we're getting from the browser, we want to send it, and we want to send details, result, and details, result, and time string. So let's send all of them and let's see how that works. So I'm going to say details plus result plus time string, and you know what, we'll actually need to test this out, but this might cause issues, but we'll see. So that's what we needed to do in here. There's nothing really that we need to modify, so I'm just going to write and quit. So I'm going to save that there. We now need to create the fingerprint.php script that will actually save the results, or will receive what's being sent by that JavaScript script or code, which is the actual browser information, and we'll then save it into a text file. So for this, we're going to say sudo vim in the same directory fp.php. So I'm now going to create a PHP script here. So PHP, and we will then just close the tag in here. So in here, we need to declare a couple of variables. All right, so in the essence of saving some time, because I don't want to write this and have errors, I've created the PHP script here. So you can see we have a variable called data that will be equal to essentially we'll say the client IP address, and then it's going to get the IP from the server header, that's the remote address, and then it's going to get the contents that are being sent by that JavaScript code running on index.html, and then it's going to save that data into a file that's stored under the same directory. So var www.html fingerprint.js2, it'll be called fingerprint.txt, and it's just going to print out the data and append to it. So that means that new values, or when a new browser accesses the web page, it will add in the data as opposed to overwriting it. So we're just going to write and quit now. And one thing that we want to do is just say sudo chown, and we want to provide ownership to the www data service account and group to var www.html and fingerprint.js2, and we're going to say system sudo systemctl restart apache 2. And now if all of this works, when we reload this particular page, we'll click on get construction tips, and it will generate, there we are, it will generate or get the information of the browser here, and it outputs it. We can actually disable that, but it saves it in text format on separate lines or on new lines. So you can see, although there's no wrapping here, it should actually save it on a new line. Let's see whether that fingerprint.txt file was created. And remember, before this, it didn't exist. So if I now say lsal, we have fingerprint.txt, and that was created a few seconds ago. So fingerprint.txt, if we cap the values, there we are. It's actually saving it on a different line. So the client IP is this one right here. The user agent is displayed. So pretty much all the info is being saved in here. Now, let's make one more change to index.html, and I want to get rid of this here. I don't want the details to be displayed. Again, I'm just trying to make the website look a bit more legitimate, so we can get rid of that in here. And if I write and quit, and let me just restart the web server to be sure, and I try and reload our construction tips website, and I click on this here. It'll display the actual fingerprint, the unique fingerprint, and the time it took to calculate the fingerprint, which is fine, but it should add that second entry into fingerprint.txt. So let's actually test this out. So cat fingerprint.txt, and we should have those two unique values. There we are, not unique because it's the same browser, but you can see that it appends. Excellent. So this is what I would typically do during a red team operation if I was trying to perform active client information gathering, more specifically browser fingerprinting. Now, I'm not yet done because this is really halfway. We're not exactly where we want to be, and for a couple of reasons. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to really quickly on my other computer here, I'm just going to make another request to that particular system. So just give me a moment. I'll get back to you when I'm done. All right, so I'm done, and this is going to be a different operating system. Let's actually see if it did work firstly. So we can see that, this came from another IP. So another computer on my local network. In reality, it would be another another IP address that's coming from a different network. But we can see that the user agent tells us Mozilla 5.0 Macintosh. So this is a Mac, and it looks like it's running some version of Chrome here. But is this really accurate? And this brings me to the final resource that I wanted to share with you. And that is this really, really cool tool that will parse this for you. And that's called the Parse a User Agent String tool on explore.whatismybrowser.com. This is a phenomenal tool because let me show you how this works. I'll just take in that user agent that I copied, and I'm going to parse it here. And there we are. Fantastic. What this does is it actually tells you what browser is being used, but not only that, the version of the operating system. And in this particular case, you can see it says Chrome on macOS Catalina. Just from that user agent, I was able to get that info. And the reason for that is because these user agents will be different in many ways, but all point to a specific configuration more specifically when you're dealing with the Mac operating system. Now I know that the actual, you can see it's an Intel Mac here, which is very, very useful info, but we're able to also have the build here, but this actually gives you a conclusive answer. Now it's not 100% accurate, but for example, if we tried and took the earlier user agent here, which we know is the Kali Linux system, let's see whether this gives us an accurate response here. So I'm just going to paste that in here and say parse this agent, and you can see the closest it gives us in terms of a concrete answer, or the most accurate info it can give us is that it's Firefox 115 on Linux, but nothing more than that. Now this is more useful or more effective on operating systems that are again most likely to be used by an employee like Windows or Mac. So I'm just going to try and load this up on one of my Windows systems, and let's see whether we can deduce the same or more information if we were dealing with Windows. So just give me a second. Alright, so I just made a request with my Windows system, and I'm just going to cat out the fingerprint.txt file here. And there we are. So we have this user agent here, which, on first glance is obviously a Windows user agent, but let's see what this particular website tells us. So you can see that it says Chrome 123 on Windows 10. Now this is incorrect. The reason this is incorrect is because it's running Windows 11. Now that is important, but you can see that in the case of Windows, it actually gives us a lot more useful information like the architecture here. The Windows NT value here refers to the kernel, but we're able to get a lot of info, and we know that Chrome 123 is one of the latest releases as of making this video. But the bottom line is that's how it works, and of course you can try it with different browsers. So let me try it now with Firefox on the same Windows system, and let's see whether it picks up on that change. Alright, so I just made a new request or loaded that page up on Firefox, and looks like there we are. So we have a different one now. That's the user agent there, and I'm just going to paste it in here. Let's see whether anything changes. There we are. The only thing that changes is the version, or rather the actual browser and the browser version or build number there. But you can actually take a look at some of the additional data that you get regarding the actual browser. So we've taken a look at the user agent and how to parse that, but we have the language. We also have information like the resolution of the screen, which might not be that important right now, but you get the idea. Other bits of info are, for example, the supported formats or the regular plugins here, ad block obviously, and the tech support. This is more specifically related to Mozilla telemetry or data that Mozilla, or the configuration that Mozilla supports. Now, if we take a look at the Mac OS request here, we sort of get a similar type of result. However, we also get the Navigator platform, which tells us that it's an Intel-based Mac, which can be very important when you're targeting Mac OS, because we now have the Silicon Macs. And in here we can see that we don't really get anything else, but we're able to get the WebGL version here. Adblock is false, and touch support is false as well here. And in this particular case, yeah, that's not tech support, that is touch support, my bad. I was specifically remembering something else, but we can see the Navigator platform is Win32, the CPU class is unknown, so that we weren't able to get, and the same for the actual Chrome, the request I made with Chrome here. But that is in a nutshell what active client information gathering looks like, more specifically browser fingerprinting. And I just wanted to give you this practical example so that you can actually see that this info can be gathered. And the bottom line is, if I was using this as an example, I know the user is running Windows, and while I don't have everything, I can now utilize more social engineering techniques or active client information gathering techniques, like through social engineering, trying to coerce information. If I wanted to build, let's say, a malicious Word document or something like that, the bottom line is I now know that I'm dealing with a Windows operating system, and in reality I would have set up a much better looking website, obviously one that doesn't tell the user that the info is being extracted, but just with the modifications we did, you could already see that it's starting to look a little bit legitimate. But with that being said, that brings us to the end of the practical demonstration section of this video. All right, so that was how to perform active client information gathering, more specifically browser fingerprinting, and hopefully you found value in that. As I said, the resources are all publicly available, and at the end it's entirely up to you and how you want to set up the infrastructure, whether you want a domain. And ultimately the final key piece of info that I want you to take from this video, specifically with regards to browser fingerprinting, is that you will still need to convince the employee to click on that link, but once they do, in a matter of seconds you'll be able to get that data. With that being said, that brings us to the end of this video and the end of the client-side information gathering section of this course. We're now going to turn our attention to social engineering and obviously phishing, and we'll take a look at some practical live lab demos here on INE, as well as a couple of some very cool techniques. We'll also be then, moving on to, payload or resource development, and a lot more. So there's a lot more planned for this course. And yeah, that brings us to the end of this video, and I will be seeing you in the next video. Introduction to social engineering. So now that we've got a fundamental understanding of what client-side attacks are, the various client-side attack vectors that exist, and how that whole process works with regards to the general methodology, we can begin turning our attention to social engineering. Now, I've mentioned social engineering quite a bit in the early sections of this course, or the sections leading up to this particular section, and we touched upon it in the second section of this course when we were going over the process of both active and passive client information gathering. But now I want to go through social engineering, or introduce you to social engineering properly or correctly, specifically from the perspective or in the context of penetration testing. So you may know about social engineering, and you may have some preconceptions of social engineering, or you may not know anything about social engineering. And my objective here is to take all of my experience and knowledge that I've gained through hundreds of pen tests that I've done that have included social engineering, and to try and disseminate it as clearly as possible. At the end of this particular section, we're going to have a lab demo on the INE platform, where I'll show you how to use a tool or framework like GoPhish to set up a phishing campaign, and to show you what that looks like. But this will all be leading up to what we'll be covering in the next sections within this course. But with that being said, let's not waste any more time. What is social engineering? So in the context of penetration testing and red teaming, social engineering is a technique that is used to manipulate individuals or employees within an organization in order to gain unauthorized access to sensitive information, systems, or facilities. And what it does is it exploits human psychology, or really the human element of an organization. So we're looking for vulnerabilities in humans or human psychology. We're looking for, we're essentially looking to exploit trust and obviously the relationship or the communication that you've established with a particular employee. So you're sort of taking advantage of, various archetypes that you find in different people. And of course, people are very different, but at the end of the day, you'll see that in that organizational setting, there's a lot of things that you can utilize to essentially get your way. And I'll clarify what that means shortly. But the objective here is to exploit human psychology, trust, and vulnerabilities to deceive targets into performing actions that compromise security. Now, this can be either through information disclosure, so you're getting an employee to tell you something that they shouldn't regarding the organization you're trying to target, or by performing specific actions that may seem innocuous at first glance, but are probably malicious later down the line, or can be seen as malicious later down the line. To best explain this, I can give you a couple of examples. In the first case here, where we're talking about information disclosure, it's very similar to the example I gave you when we are talking about client-side information gathering, where you essentially are trying to get information, specific information from an employee that, at first glance may not look or will not look that suspicious, like asking for the version of Microsoft Word that the employee is using. And that was the pretext of that was the fact that the employee tried to open a document that you uploaded, and that was your resume, and you configure that document to appear like it's corrupted, only for the employee to reach back out, to actually reach back out to you and say, hey, we couldn't open the document. What's the issue? And you would then respond essentially saying, it may be a compatibility issue. Let me know what version of Microsoft Office you're using. And, the employee is more likely to tell you that because you've established this back and forth. Whereas if you ask for that information directly, that will be, obviously suspicious. The second case is where you're trying to get employees to do something. For example, click on this link. You may establish a fictitious relationship, or a relationship where you play a fictitious character, let's say a recruitment agent or officer at a particular organization, and you try and get them to reveal some insider information. Now, in the context of a pen tester, what you're really looking for is either information that can help you during your resource development phase, or in the development of payloads, or you're looking for information that can, again, essentially assist in the execution of your payload. But moving on, social engineering attacks in general aim to bypass technical controls by targeting the weakest link in the security chain. And this is well known even in organizations today. It's actually one of the major issues that organizations are facing, and that's the human element. Because you can secure computers as best as possible, you can set up monitoring, but even the individuals monitoring, or actually monitoring the logs, are susceptible, or essentially will make mistakes. And on an employee level, or at an employee level, you're generally speaking looking to take advantage of tired employees or busy employees, where they're not likely to follow any security training that they may have received, like, for example, not downloading attachments, so on and so forth. So the core point behind this particular slide is you're trying to take advantage of human beings. Now, that may seem, there's a lot of moral questions here, but the bottom line is, as a pen tester, you have been tasked with finding these issues, and attackers, again, have no ethics either way. So they are going to use this particular technique when we're talking about client-side attacks anyway. So the reason I'm telling you this is because you need to be aware of this, when performing a pen test. So the premise of social engineering is to exploit the human element, as I've reiterated quite a bit now. And in other words, or to put it simply, putting people or employees in situations where they will rely on their base instincts and the most common forms of social interaction, like, for example, the desire to be helpful. So these particular points here, or these instincts, or baseline archetypes, if you will, in terms of human behavior, are some of the ones that I have encountered, or ones that work well, at least in my experience and the experience of a lot of my peers. So you, generally speaking, want to leverage, the following elements in a human being or in a person. The first being a desire to be helpful. So, people want to feel helpful. They want to come across as helpful. So, that's one way you can try and gain information. And I'll talk about pretexting because that plays into each of these. Secondly, the tendency to trust people, and this is very common, especially, and of course, I'm trying to be as politically correct as possible. When you're talking about Western countries or the Western world, if you will, there is obviously, based on how the society is developed, the society is very well organized, and as a result, people in Western societies are more likely to trust someone or a stranger, and that again comes down to a lot of factors, but is one of the reasons why you have a lot of these these tech scams or tech support scams. And in other countries, for example, this applies to many other cases. you'll typically see there's a tendency to not trust individuals, from the get-go, and not take, an individual's word or hold it at face value. The third element here is the desire for approval, which is again very, very powerful. A lot of people want approval of some form, and that's something that you can build into your pretext or pretexting, if you will, or messaging as you're trying to establish this relationship with an employee. And as I said, you may be wondering to yourself, this looks like a very tedious process, and generally speaking, it is going to be quite a tedious process if you're trying to get as much info as possible, or you're trying to get that employee to do something for you, again, inadvertently, because that's the ultimate objective, is that when the company realizes there's been a breach of security, you don't want them to be in a position where an employee says, oh, it must be this person because they reached out asking for this. So you're trying to make communication look as natural as possible. And as you know, the desire for approval is quite strong in everyone, really. Fourth, the fear of getting in trouble, which makes a lot of sense. And this is a tactic that isn't that successful, especially for high-level employees. Because again, they rarely get into trouble, or they're past that particular stage in their career. But it can work great for young employees or career entrants who are not looking to mess up anything. So you typically in that case use something like a very urgent email asking them to review something, or you can essentially form a relationship and then use this as a pretext to inquire for a specific piece of info, or to download, let's say, an attachment. And then, of course, finally, you have avoiding conflict or arguments, which again, I think a lot of you can understand. Most people want to avoid conflict of any kind by all means necessary. So if there is a chance for them to do that, then they will obviously try and do it. And that's where you can essentially come in and try and exploit that vulnerability or that affliction, if you will, to avoiding conflict or arguments. The bottom line here is that these are, again, based on my experience, what you'll typically see within employees or individuals working in an organization, especially when you're trying to, again, establish these relationships. These are the elements or parts of the psychology that you can take advantage of. Now, to sort of reiterate or to again continue on what I've just said, by preying on the human element of system access, most times attackers do not have to navigate around the security perimeter of an organization. So this is sort of pointing out why this is so powerful, and why a lot of the large data breaches that you see or attacks that you see are, as a direct result of social engineering. If you remember, as of me recording this video, it's quite recent, but when you watch it, it might be a few years ahead. But the recent Rockstar Games hack, where a very young kid was able to gain access to credentials through a social engineering attack, you can see that a lot of these large organizations are actually being breached by these types of attacks, or by client-side attacks, but more specifically social engineering attacks. So the bottom line is, you don't need to be a skilled hacker to get access into a company's digital infrastructure. You just need to be able to, again, target a particular employee within the organization that has that level of access, and try and get them or coerce them into giving you that information somehow. And you can do that by, again, leveraging what I mentioned in the previous slide, these 5 character traits or personality traits, if you will, which again don't apply to everyone, but generally speaking, you'll see there is an overlap with the majority of the population. Bottom line is that attackers, or pen testers in your case, just need to engage with the employees inside the company and let the employees do the bidding for you. And instead of spending countless hours trying to infiltrate the systems or networks through traditional server-side attacks like brute force attacks, attackers can leverage social engineering to yield information or facilitate the execution of malware inside the company network in a matter of minutes, which is truly the case. You'll be shocked to know or to see yourself how successful these attacks are, whether you're trying to get credentials, getting them to click on a link, as we covered, one of the links that you can send employees was the link we developed in the client fingerprinting video, where I showed you how you can easily identify the browser and the operating system that an employee is using on their computer. Now, when we talk about social media, because again, social media will play a crucial role in, or plays a crucial role in social engineering, and will do so for yourself. What we need to understand is we need sort of a historical understanding, or we need to understand what social media brings to the table. So the advent and adoption, and that's the key word here, of social networking as a form of communication has vastly improved the ability and effectiveness of attackers, and likewise pen testers, to perform social engineering attacks, such as attacks as employees or targets can easily be contacted by anyone in the world with ease. So given that most people, again, even people working in an organization, have social media profiles, and of course there may be company-wide policies that state what an employee can or cannot post. The bottom line is that, generally speaking, social media profiles at this point are quite old, or someone has had them for more than 5 years, and they've posted different types of things, again, not being cognizant of the security implications. But the bottom line is you can learn a lot about someone by taking a look at their social media profile. And of course, there's different social media profiles that sort of expose a different side to a person. So for example, if I wanted to learn about someone's interests, go to Facebook or Instagram, that will give me, sort of a basic idea of what their interests are. I can then use that info to, let's say, establish communication with the individual, or, try and set up a web page and direct them to it, a web page that, again, caters to their interests. You can also, again, there's multiple ways of leveraging social media information or social media with regards to social engineering. So if you think about it yourself, what's the first thing you do when you meet someone? You try and find their social media profiles. Now, of course, that may sound a little bit weird, but I'm just talking generally. The same thing that employers do. When they employ someone, or when they're looking at employing someone, they'll, generally speaking, check the employee's social media page to see if, in the case of companies, to see if the individual aligns with the company culture. But social networks have also led to the rise of employees advertently or inadvertently exposing a lot of private information, which can include company information, that can be used by attackers in aid of their social engineering attacks. So think of emails, phone numbers, addresses, or even information about events. I'll give you another example. So if an employee is posting about, let's say, an event that the organization is having, the event might point towards the fact that the organization will be very busy during that period of time. You can use this as a way to, again, come in or essentially add on to that stress that the company is going through, by, again, sending specific emails that people will be more likely to answer, just given the fact that they are tired or stressed out. They're not going to be paying attention to the sender info. And again, if you tailor the email, or you tailor your social engineering campaign to be tied to that particular event, for example, let's say a conference or something like that, then you can find a lot of success there. But that's a very rare case. I was just giving you an example of what that looks like. Now, before we proceed any further, I want to give you a brief history of social engineering, and it'll sort of ground you or provide you with, a fundamental understanding of what it is all about. And, while many cybersecurity professionals, yourself included, may think of social engineering as a technique or a practice that is exclusive to offensive security, or something that attackers or hackers, invented and use, that couldn't be farther from the truth. Social engineering is actually a very old practice, and it is as old as time, at least if we use the modern parlance to describe it as such. But as long as there has been information that's coveted, or important information, there have always been people seeking to exploit it. And this is one of the techniques that, while they may not have coined it in that way, a lot of the intelligence agencies around the world utilize to extract information from individuals. Now, the CIA or the Mossad or any of these intelligence agencies call this target development. They essentially refer to social engineering is target development. And target development is really the process of establishing a relationship with an individual that has information that is useful to you. And it takes quite a bit of time. But apologies for digressing there. Coming back to the slides, the term social engineering was first coined by the Dutch industrialist J.C. van Marken in 1894. Van Marken suggested that specialists were needed to attend to human challenges in addition to technical ones. And social engineering was defined as a way to encourage people to handle social relations similarly to how they approach machines or mechanical systems. So essentially, what he was saying here was that you need to factor in, or at least include, the dynamics you see when you're dealing with a mechanical system, and understand that people, just like a computer program, all have inbuilt algorithms that again impact the way they react to certain events, or the way they will respond to certain things, or what makes them tick, if you will. And the bottom line here was that in order for you to get the best out of an employee, you need to understand how they work like a machine, or as you would a machine, and then fine-tune your approach to that employee based on your findings. Now, that may seem a little bit cynical and malicious, but I wanted to give you this brief history lesson, because I think it'll tell you a lot about what defines a successful social engineering campaign and an unsuccessful one. And I hope that summed it up. Of course, this will start making sense as we progress, but that brings us obviously to the link between social engineering and pen testing, which might, I think is already clear with the examples I've given you. But while social engineering has been a very viable attack vector for attackers, and now I'm referring to malicious attackers or hackers, or threat actors, nation state sponsored groups or APT groups, it's usually been overlooked by penetration testers until very recently, and really taken up in red team engagements or red team operations. You'll rarely see social engineering being used during a pen test. It's really, for some reason, been siloed into red teaming or traditional red teaming. I think it all comes down to the physical aspect of social engineering. So the key thing to note here is that contextualizing and operationalizing social engineering as a valid attack vector in penetration testing is a vital skill or a vital skill set to possess as a modern penetration tester. The point I'm trying to make here is, if attackers are using it, malicious attackers that is, then you as a pen tester need to know how to use it, because your job as a pen tester is to show a company that has hired you where the issues are within the security infrastructure, or to give them a much clearer understanding of their security posture. And if you don't find or perform social engineering during the pen test, given that it is within the scope, or taking into account that it's included in the scope, you will not give the company an accurate idea of what they're dealing with. And the bottom line is, attackers are all starting from the outside, and this is really the only way in. So social engineering is something you need to test for, or you need to factor in or incorporate into your pen test if you want to be a good pen tester. So in penetration testing and red teaming exercises, phishing simulations are valuable for assessing an organization's susceptibility to social engineering attacks and identifying areas for improvement in security awareness and controls, which is one of the things I do when I'm doing red teaming. We'll usually have not full-scale red team operations, but a company may hire me and tell me, or rather my firm, that during the year we want to run 6 phishing campaigns. I want you to run 6 phishing campaigns at a random time, and I want you to see whether there's an improvement, so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that companies have started factoring in phishing attacks or phishing simulations, if you will, to try and see whether the employees are, continually falling for the same mistakes or making the same mistakes, or whether there's an improvement with regards to the training that the company is giving them. So that's another important thing to factor in. And that, of course, brings us to the types of social engineering. Now, we'll be exploring a lot of these, but really in this particular course, we'll be focusing on phishing, and pretexting, right? And also spear phishing to a certain extent, at least at a conceptual level. So phishing, if you're not familiar with it, is, deceptive emails, messages, or websites designed to trick recipients into revealing confidential information such as passwords, account credentials, or financial data. You then, of course, have spear phishing. So these are targeted phishing attacks that are customized for specific individuals or groups within an organization. And that's really what we're going to be doing, because spear phishing makes the most sense after you've performed reconnaissance and target identification. So you know who you're targeting. So the phishing attacks or campaigns are targeted, and that's what spear phishing is all about. So this is where you use personalized information or context or pretext to increase the credibility of your emails or your communication. You then have vishing and smishing, which are essentially, in the case of vishing, these are phone calls or voice messages where attackers impersonate legitimate entities. This is also quite useful, quite powerful, and has worked for me quite a bit of times. And then, of course, you have smishing, which again is phishing attacks conducted via SMS or text messages, where the recipients are tricked into clicking on malicious links or providing sensitive information by impersonating trusted entities. And this was actually a technique that was actually used by the Israeli cybersecurity firm that created Pegasus, where they would send a journalist an SMS message with the exact sort of tracking link or browser fingerprinting link that we generated in the previous section, that would essentially inform the organization or the unit that's that's responsible for that campaign what mobile device this particular target is using, and then they could stage their attack or develop payloads that would work on that particular device. And then, of course, you have pretexting, which we'll actually be covering in depth in the next video. So pretexting is creating a false pretext or scenario to gain the trust of targets and extract sensitive information. And this may involve impersonating authority figures, colleagues, or service providers to manipulate victims into divulging confidential data. You then have baiting, so that involves luring targets into performing a specific action, like clicking on a malicious link, opening a malicious file, etc. And again, you may be seeing sort of an overlap here, and that's fine, but these are the various types or techniques that you'll see. The difference between phishing and baiting is that you're using incentives or enticing incentives like free software prizes or job opportunities. So you're trying to tap into that psychology that I mentioned, or the human element, if you will. And then, of course, you have tailgating, which is a physical form of social engineering, where you're essentially trying to follow authorized individuals into restricted areas or facilities without proper authorization or authentication, and attackers will typically exploit social norms or courtesy to gain unauthorized access to secure locations. So now that we've gotten a high-level overview of the various forms of social engineering or types of social engineering attacks or techniques, it's time to turn our attention to the ones we'll be focusing on, namely phishing. So phishing, as I've already defined it, can be thought of as one of the most prevalent and effective social engineering attacks used in penetration testing and red teaming. And it typically involves the following steps, which you'll actually see an overlap with the client-side attack methodology that I outlined in the first section of this course. But you typically start off with planning and reconnaissance. So this is where attackers research the target organization to identify potential targets, gather information about employees, and understand the organization's communication channels and protocols. You then have message crafting, or the process of developing, the message or messaging that you'll be using. So attackers create deceptive emails or messages designed to mimic legitimate communications from trusted sources such as colleagues, IT departments, or financial institutions, to name a few. These messages often include urgent or compelling language to evoke a sense of urgency or fear. And if we go back to that particular slide, that's one of the personality traits or aspects of a human being that this this particular example is trying to take advantage of. So people are always afraid of messing up, and you're trying to use language that invokes a sense of urgency that then essentially infers to the employee that if they don't get this done in a timely fashion, they're going to mess something up, or they're going to be in trouble, to put it very candidly. But moving on, you then have the delivery phase, which is where the attackers send phishing emails or messages to targeted individuals within the organization, which can be thought of spear phishing, but we'll get into that shortly. And they use techniques to bypass spam filters and security controls, and that's what resource development is all about. That's the next section of this course, where you're going to be buying domains, setting up your mail servers, so on and so forth, essentially in preparation for your social engineering campaigns or your phishing campaigns. Attackers may also leverage social engineering tactics to increase the likelihood of recipients opening the messages. That essentially ties back down to those personality traits that I pointed out, or those archetypes. They're really archetypes, if you will. And then, of course, you have deception and manipulation. So this essentially involves sort of beefing up the messaging. So the phishing messages contain malicious links, attachments, or requests for sensitive information, and recipients are deceived into clicking on links, downloading attachments, or providing login credentials under false pretenses. So you're essentially trying to use deception, or trying to shore up your communication to make it look as legitimate as possible, and then asking or manipulating the employee to do something like, as you can see here, clicking on a link, downloading an attachment. And a lot of how you can get someone to do this is through pretexting, which is what I'll be covering in the next video. But moving on, you then have the exploitation phase. So this is fairly self-explanatory. So once the victim interacts with the phishing message, attackers exploit vulnerabilities in the target systems or applications to gain unauthorized access, install malware, or steal sensitive information, whatever their objectives are. And that brings us then to spear phishing, which is very common, is very similar rather to phishing, but I wanted to explain it because you'll actually understand the nuances between the two. So spear phishing is a targeted, and that's the key word, is a targeted form of phishing attack that tailors malicious emails or messages to specific individuals or groups within an organization. Unlike traditional phishing attacks, which cast a wide net and aim to deceive as many recipients as possible, spear phishing attacks are highly personalized and customized to exploit the unique characteristics, interests, and relationships of the intended target. So this is where aspects like performing a bit more research on a particular employee that has access to vital info. For example, someone in the accounting department, let's say her name is Alice. You try and learn more about her interest, and then try and come up with a spear phishing campaign that again allures or attends to those interests, or will make it easier for her to again take you at face value with regards to your communication and establish a sense of trust, which again can take a bit of time. But that's in essence the difference between phishing and spear phishing, where you're essentially personalizing the message. It's not just a wide net that, or a large number of emails you're sending out. These need to be crafted very, very carefully. So a lot of work has to go into spear phishing, because now you're factoring in that additional information gathering, which I'll break down here. So what does the spear phishing process look like? Well, the only thing that differs are the first 2 or 3 phases. After that, it's exactly what you would see with the phishing process. So what differs is phase 1, where you have the target selection and research. So this is where attackers carefully select their targets based on specific criteria such as job roles, departments, or organizational hierarchies. Extensive reconnaissance is conducted to gather information about the targets, including names, job titles, roles, responsibilities, work relationships, and personal interests. One key thing here, when I mentioned work relationships, that's actually something you can leverage. So for example, if you know that a particular employee is very close or works in the same department as you, or as that particular employee, or your target, then you can say within your email that, hey, please check out this particular invoice. Mark sent it to me, and you know that Mark works in that same department. That adds a sense of legitimacy to that email, because the person will say, there's no way an external individual will know that we have someone called Mark in this department. So that's just a small example there. You then have your standard, publicly available sources of data that, social media profiles, corporate directories, and leaked data may be mined or can be mined to compile detailed profiles of the targets. In terms of message tailoring, this obviously changes from the traditional phishing approach, in the sense that you're using gathered information. With the information you've gathered in phase 1, the attackers will craft highly personalized and convincing emails or messages designed to appear legitimate and trustworthy. And the content of the messages may reference recent events, projects, or activities relevant to the target's roles or the interests to enhance credibility. So you're trying to leverage all of these activities that, again, the individual or the employee might be involved in as a way to add legitimacy to your communication or to your messaging, if you will. And of course, attackers may impersonate trusted individuals such as colleagues, so you may want to do that, although that is quite risky. But supervisors, external partners, that's always a good one. External partners is a very, very that usually in my experience has had a very high probability of success. And this increases the likelihood of the targets opening the messages and taking the desired actions. And then thirdly, the delivery. So spear phishing messages are delivered to the targeted individuals via email, social media, instant messaging platforms, or other communication channels. And attackers employ tactics to bypass email security filters and anti-phishing mechanisms such as using compromised or spoofed email accounts, exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities, or leveraging trusted third-party services. And that brings us to the end of this video. So with regards to spear phishing, the rest of the phases of the phishing process remain the same. It's really those first 3 that change, and I've outlined how they differ. So that was really the largest video section in this course, and for good reason, because now that you have this fundamental knowledge of what client-side attacks are and what social engineering is all about, we're now going to start moving into more practical videos where we'll be putting everything we've learned into action. But before we do that, we have one more theoretical video that we need to get into that covers the art or the practice of pretexting, and I'll be sharing some really cool resources with you. So with that being said, that brings us to the end of this video, and I will be seeing you in the next video.